This evening, I want to talk about the interlinkage of crisis, because now everybody recognizes the situation that we're in. Everyone understands that we are living in a time when crisis is right on the front pages every day, particularly the financial crises between a few, for the past few weeks. But also, I think this brings to the fore that there are other kinds of crises and that they're all interlinked. And I want, therefore, in the short time that we have together, which will be until about 7:30, so we do have an hour and 15 minutes for those of you who want to stay and ask questions or make comments, I want to try to talk about the interlinkages that exist between the social crisis, which is also a serious crisis of inequality, the financial crisis, and the ecological crisis, the climate change crisis, and see if there are not ways that we could find, and if this is perhaps not a period of great opportunity. I personally think it is a period of opportunity, but that this window is not going to stay open that long. And therefore, anyone who is interested in the state of the world should be also in a state of high alert, because now we are, those of us who foresaw the financial crisis in particular, we're very much à la mode. We're very much listened to now. We're invited to be on radio and television and so on. But this, my experience is that this isn't necessarily going to last. And that as soon as it seems to be feasible, the powers that be will try to go back to business as usual. We can see it with the banks. They don't want to pronounce the word, the terrible N word of nationalization, because that sounds permanent. You can talk about participating in the capital of the banks, but don't mention nationalization, please, because that sounds too definitive. So let's start with the social crisis, which has been building up over many years. It is now worldwide. It exists in the developed countries and in the poorer countries of the South. In the United States, the top 1% of the population was receiving about 8% of the revenues towards 1950. Then I thought that this had doubled, and that was the figure I was using, that the top 1% was getting 16% of the national revenues by the beginning of the new millennium. And then just a few days ago, the OECD, a very serious organization, published a report that shows that the top 1% of American citizens were receiving 22% of the national income. This is the greatest situation of inequality since the late 1920s, just before the crisis of '29. But this is the case. It's not perhaps so extreme everywhere. But the disparities have been growing between the top and the bottom almost everywhere, at least in the countries where 90% of the world's population live. And these inequalities are very bad for growth and development. You cannot, we're in a school of development. Development doesn't occur under situations of great poverty. And personally, I don't think that growth, as it is now understood, is the solution. But for those who do believe that growth is the solution, it is not going to happen under situations of deep inequality. Over the past 25 years, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have been applying policies of structural adjustment all over the South, which have also had the effect of impoverishing the poor people, but also concentrating wealth at the top of Southern societies, where we can also see that, as in our own countries in the North, the gap between capital and labor is also measurable. What economists call the share of added value in an economy. How much is going to capital, how much is going to labor? This has shifted deeply, so that now in Eastern Europe, it's half and half. In France, which used to be rather an egalitarian country, at least towards in the 60s and 70s, it was 74% for labor and 26% for capital. Now France is down to 57% for labor and for capital, and the rest for labor. There's been a very big shift, a very big growth in the share that capital has, and a drop in the share of labor. And this has been possible because of delocalization, because of globalization, etc., which is extremely favorable to the owners of capital, but it has also increased mobility, and it has increased the competition between workers all over the world who may never meet. In Europe, which is the society I know best, we now have a European Commission which encourages all of this inequality decisions which say that you can pay an Eastern European worker wages that are Eastern European and have that person work under Eastern European conditions when they are working in a Western European country where the legal wage is far higher and the working conditions are far better. Those are just a very few examples. But the reign of finance throughout the world has been one in which capital has been rewarded, work has been much less so, and the inequalities are therefore growing. The poverty inequality crisis has been also grossly underestimated by official institutions like the World Bank. And I want to say straight away that there is no excuse for such a crisis. The world is actually awash in money, even though we are in a banking and hedge fund crisis. According to Merrill Lynch, the name of a brokerage house you probably all recognize, the World Wealth Report that they publish every year said in 2008 edition, the 11th edition, that there were about 10 million people in the world that they call the high net worth individuals, who between them have $40.7 trillion. I will say that in French because the way of doing trillions and thousands of billions is different in the two languages. 40 000 milliards de dollars et des poussières qui sont entre les mains de 10 millions de personnes dans le monde. Most of those people in Europe and North America, but not all of them. Wealth is also growing in China, in India, in Latin America, etc. And there is no excuse for poverty in a world where there are tax havens that shelter at least another $12 trillion, 12 000 milliards de dollars. Nobody knows exactly how much, but according to the very lowest estimates, if the money now hidden in tax havens were actually taxed, that would bring a minimum of $250 billion a year in taxes to various governments. This is not confined just to rich individuals in the North and in North America, Europe. No, over the past 35 years, the elites of Africa have sent over $420 billion to northern tax havens. Two researchers at the University of Massachusetts have published a detailed paper on this, and they show that with interest that would come today to over $600 billion, which most of it was aid coming from the North, which has not been distributed or used in any way for the good of African societies, but has gone into individual bank accounts. However, since much of this money came from the contributions, the loans from foreign governments and foreign institutions, those loans are still due, and Africans are still paying back that fictitious money from which they never benefited. And they are paying back on the order still of $25,000 every minute. You can build a lot of schools, a lot of hospitals, and a lot of roads and so on with $25,000 every minute. And right now, as we speak, the banks are lobbying furiously to stay out of the clutches of governments. They don't want to be run by governments, God knows. And so we mustn't let them win, but if we continue on the trajectory that we are on, in which the mentality, the dominant ideology is one in which economic freedom is considered on the same level as political freedom, religious freedom, freedom of the press or of expression or of opinion, and that is the climate we have been living in for the last 30 years. That's what my most recent book is about. La pensée enchaînée in French, Hijacking America in English. It's about how this notion that economic freedom would produce good results, that your money was your own, that you had no duties of solidarity to anyone else, that public is always worse than private, and anything private is good and anything public is bad. This is the ideology, along with privatization of all public services, etc., that has dominated our thinking over the last decades. And this is the thinking that is being challenged by the crisis. I just want to give you the figures you need to be able to challenge the notion that there isn't enough money to do what needs to be done. Because there is plenty of money. The problem is getting at it, and that is what I will try to explain at the end, how that is, we can do that. So there is a social crisis, a crisis of inequality. When there are increases in food prices, as there have been recently, as I'm sure you are all aware, this immediately plunges millions of people who thought that they were escaping poverty gradually and who were sort of on a ledge just above the poverty trap, and they have fallen back in because poor people spend a huge proportion of their family budget on food. And when the price of food goes up by 50% or 100%, naturally, they are plunged right back into poverty. A new phenomenon has happened in the past year. That is that we have had the first worldwide food crisis with riots in 35 countries. That this is the first time, because before famines and food crises were pretty much localized. Yes, you could have something in one African country, but not in another. But since also the World Bank and the IMF have spent the last several decades telling these countries export crops are the important thing. Forget about food crops. You can get your food on the international market. There's no danger there. And since it's the international market that sets the worldwide price, and since meanwhile we have also been dumping, by we I mean the Americans, Canadians, and the Europeans, have been dumping our food products on the markets of poorer countries where poor farmers simply cannot compete with subsidized crops that are produced under conditions of highly capital-intensive farming. So they're undersold. This is most visible, perhaps, in the NAFTA agreement, the ALENA, the agreement of free trade between North America, the North American Free Trade Agreement with US, Mexico, and Canada, as you know. And this has ruined hundreds of thousands of Mexican farmers, often in the poorest states of Mexico, who are no longer obviously producing corn for their people, and they have gone into the cities where they contribute to the ranks of the poor and the unemployed, and again are not going to be able to eat because they have neither land to grow food anymore, they've been ruined, nor do they have money to buy it. So that gives an idea of how the crises fit into each other. They also fit into the, well, I should add that the speculation on food followed the speculation on housing. People who were investing in the markets, once the housing bubble started to burst, they were looking around for other investments. And among those investments, they chose food commodities, not that they really wanted to take delivery of several tons of rice or wheat or corn and have them dumped on the pavement on Wall Street. No, but they did hope that by betting on the price of a food contract at a certain distance, that they could make a lot of money on them. And that has been one of the major factors contributing to the increase in the price of food, along with agrofuels produced in the United States, which is now devoting at least a third of its corn and soya land to producing agrofuels. So you can see there, for instance, that the ecological crisis is also fitting into the food crisis. If you have dependency on petroleum and you decide to use agrofuels in the place of that, there's no proof that these reduce global warming. There is proof that the farmers in Iowa and Illinois are very happy. And even if Barack Obama is elected president, as I hope he will be, he's not going to change the policy on agrofuels, agrocarburants, because his home state of Illinois is also very dependent on them. The ecological crisis, I think personally, is the most severe of all. I say that because in politics or in economics, you can sometimes go back and start over and say, okay, we messed up. Let's do this differently. And that is one of these times now in the economy. I think that is an option, to go back and start over in a certain number of areas. And I'll make that clearer as we go along. But with nature, you can't go back and start over. You do not have a situation which is mathematically clear, in which you add an extra unit and then an extra unit and then an extra unit of CO2, and the graph goes up and it's nice and straight. That's not the way it works. It goes up an extra unit, an extra unit, an extra unit, and then all of a sudden, off the chart. And nobody knows when that point is reached, when the positive feedback increases the greenhouse effect to the degree that it becomes a runaway greenhouse effect. There we do not have the option. And I believe that this is going to contribute enormously also to the inequality crisis, because as we already know from the work of the UN panel on climate change, the GIEC en français, G-I-E-C, the humid areas will grow more humid, the dry areas will be drier. African rain-fed agriculture is projected to lose about 50% of its yields on current trend. We know also that biodiversity is being reduced, that we are in the 6th great extinction during geological time. That, well, you know, the 5th great extinction was when the dinosaurs were eliminated, along with many other living species. Well, we're in the 6th extinction, and we're the dinosaurs. We are the agents of that extinction. And this crisis of the environment is an encouragement also to immigration. What do people do if they can't live where they are? If their own farms have become deserts, if they have huge floods all the time, what do they try to do? They try to move somewhere else. We have not even seen the beginning of immigration, which our governments in Europe treat as exclusively a military and security and repressive. That's the only response that they have is expulsions. And I know that Canada's policy is better than the one in Europe. But at some point, everyone is going to say, but what do we do when we have millions of people who can no longer live in their own countries, literally cannot live there because physically it has become impossible. I won't go on that much more on the climate crisis, only to tell you that for me this is the most serious and the one that requires the most action immediately, and therefore is the one that we must use the financial crisis window of opportunity to attack. Now, the financial crisis, this is the one that's on everybody's front page, on everyone's lips, and we're all worried about it. But let me quote to you a very wise man who said the following: "All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind." Je vais le dire en français aussi. Tout pour nous-mêmes et rien pour les autres semble avoir été à toutes les époques du monde la vile maxime des maîtres de l'humanité. Ça n'était pas Karl Marx. C'était pas Machiavel, c'est une autre réponse que j'ai quelquefois. Est-ce que quelqu'un, pas Pierre qui sait, mais est-ce que quelqu'un a une idée de qui a dit ça? Who knows, who thinks they know who said that? All for ourselves and nothing for other people. No, Anatole France would be a good choice, but that wasn't, in this case, it wasn't Anatole France. It was somebody really well known, I'm sure, in this room to all of you. It was Adam Smith. And he said this towards the end of The Wealth of Nations, 1776. I like this quote very much because many people who are, I think most people are really decent, you know, and when I give a talk like this, usually somebody says, but isn't there a point at which greed becomes, it's enough? Isn't there a point where the people who accumulate and say that, well, that's enough, I'm rich enough? And I have to say to them, there are some examples. You can find people who will give away their money, yes, make a foundation, but as a class, Adam Smith was right. All for ourselves and nothing for other people, as a class. And if this tendency is not stopped by law and by constraint, that is the way that the world goes. I'm sorry, but that's just it. So that's what's happening right now with all of the bailouts. We can find hundreds of millions and billions for the banks within about 24 hours. The people are getting nothing out of these bailouts. They will be paid for by us, by our children, by their children, for generations to come. And so far, people are pretty quiescent. They're not saying, hey, what about the citizens? Hey, what about the environment? And what those plans are supposed to do, it's two things. One is buy up the toxic securities. I'm not going to go into the whole way that the banks put these toxic securities together and then played hot potato with them and sold them on to other people so that they're now all over the world. Nobody knows what they're worth. Nobody knows who owes what to whom. And so part of the plan is to say, well, we'll buy up your toxic securities. But they don't even ask, well, how much are these things actually worth? Because nobody knows, and the government knows that nobody knows. So they buy them up. That's one thing they do. The other is that they recognize that the real problem is that because the banks don't know what the neighbor has, I don't know what you have in your vaults, really, as a bank, and you don't know what I have, and therefore I'm not going to lend to you because I don't know if I'll be paid back, and vice versa. And since interbank lending is the circulatory, it's the blood system of the economy, it freezes everything. Banks lend to each other. This is what, you know the name of the LIBOR rate? LIBOR. Several bankers in London get together every morning, private bankers, and they fix the London interbank offered rate. It's an interest rate which says for that day, banks will lend to each other at such a rate. And as soon as the crisis broke, that rate went right up. Because banks normally lend to each other overnight or for a couple of days. My bank had more entries than outgo one day. Yours had the opposite, so I will lend to you, but tomorrow you will have more coming in than going out, so you will lend to me. That has stopped. So the idea of the plan was to help the banks to get lending to each other and then lending to people and to firms. But they're not doing that. Treasury is saying, yes, yes, we're encouraging them to do that. But they're not doing it. They're hoarding the cash. Because why? They want to buy up smaller banks and make themselves even bigger. Because they know that when they are too big to fail, they can do any stupid thing and the government will come in and save them, exactly as it's doing right now. So, I just want to stress that what we need are laws, and we need to use this crisis. Now, I wanted to talk also about the ecological footprint of the rich, but I think you can get that in one sentence, that rich people weigh on the earth much more heavily than poor ones. Lots of people talk about the impact of high population growth in the South. Yes, that's important because poor people take whatever resources they can. They will cut down trees. They will overuse soils. They will kill large mammals. But the way that the environment is really hurt is through much more through the use of nature by big ecological footprints, people and firms with dinosaur footprints. So let's talk now in the time remaining. I'm just trying to give you a very brief outline of the way these crises are interconnected. What can we do? This is obviously the interesting question. Many people have wrestled, I know I have wrestled, with the question of whether or not it's possible to save the planet, given the gravity of the crisis, while we remain in a capitalist system. On a bad day, I say no, it's not possible, because the nature of capitalism is to be predatory. It is unable to think about tomorrow or the next day. The market is always in an eternal present, and you cannot say, yes, but this action today is going to have a terrible effect 5 years down the road. It doesn't work that way. And capitalism's natural tendency is also all for ourselves and nothing for other people, and also instant gratification. So what would be the situation in which we could do something if we can't do it under capitalism? Well, the other term is usually revolution. You have to have a worldwide revolution or you can't save the planet. But that is just as desperate an answer as to say that we cannot do it under capitalism. Because at least I don't see any sign of revolution on the horizon. Sometimes I joke and I say, tell me, who is the Tsar today? Give me the name of the Tsar. Give me the address of the Winter Palace. I'll march. I'll try to take it over. But I don't know who and I don't know where to go. It's not Wall Street. You know, I mean, Wall Street was up and running after September 11th. It's up and running now. I mean, it's running as fast as it wants to run. It's not doing its real job. But so, I mean, I don't see a revolutionary party. I don't see an avant-garde of people prepared to lead. I don't see people prepared to follow. And frankly, I don't have any interest in having the kinds of policies that we did have in the so-called socialist republics. This is not my idea of heaven, and I don't think it's anybody's idea of the way we want societies to go. So we have to find a mid-term between capitalism, business as usual, and a revolution which could perhaps change everything. And that, I think, exists. I think the template for that, the model for that, it's to be found in the model of the United States during the Second World War, which in the space of 2 years, 1942 and 1943, after Pearl Harbor, was able to transform its economy completely into a war-oriented economy. And it did it through the methods of John Maynard Keynes, which is to say, targeted government spending, incentives to industry to convert, rationing, so for create fairer distribution. There was tremendous social cohesion at the time because it was a very, it was a desperate moment in US history. And in this desperate moment, everyone participated. I was a child during the Second World War, and I very well remember how we would save up our allowances to buy war stamps, and then if you got enough books of stamps, you could have a war bond, and we had a victory garden, and everybody was growing vegetables in their back gardens, and it was a time of terrific cohesion. And there was also an institution called the $1-a-year men, because the government understood about symbolism, and they chose industry leaders to be $1-a-year men. The Treasury paid them $1 a year to make sure that targets of quality and quantity were met for the armed forces. And this was a terrifically privileged and these people had so much prestige, you can't imagine. My godfather was one of them, and I used to make myself totally insupportable by bragging to my little friends that I had a godfather who was a $1-a-year man. Anyway, Keynes's methods were used during this period, and I think they could be again. What does a country generally do in a time of crisis like the one we're going through now? What does the central bank generally do? The usual standard methods are, one, to reduce interest rates. Well, I don't know if they did it today, but the federal, did they do it today? So they went down another half a percent. So now, okay, interest rates in the US at 1%, how much more can you reduce them? In Europe, even Jean-Claude Trichet, who hates the idea of reducing interest rates, even he is being obliged to do this, and the bank has said they will go below the present 3.75 that is now the interest rate. What does a government generally do? Well, it goes into debt. How much further can the U.S. go into debt? We're at $10,000 billion, and God knows how much the Paulson plan has added to this. And it can devalue the currency, but that's not a very good solution either when you're supposed to be the leading currency and the most important currency in the world. So I went back over the ancient history of the Second World War because I think that this kind of spending could be used. Now, of course, the governments are going to say, well, we don't have enough money. Yes, they do. They just don't know it, and they're not going after it. What has to be done is, A, say to the banks, first of all, this money is not yours. This money also belongs to citizens, and it belongs to nature. It belongs to fixing the environment. It belongs, in particular, to those who have ecological projects, practical ones, in alternative fuels, in alternative sources of energy, in eco-construction, in refitting houses and private dwellings so that they are energy neutral. It is needed for research into lightweight materials and better ways of increasing the practicality of environmental investments, bringing down the costs so that they can compete easily with petroleum. In other words, we have to say to the banks, from now on, you're going to, not only you're going to start lending, and we're going to measure that, and if you don't lend, then we will tax you to the point where you will have to give back all that money, so you better lend it. It's more in your interest to do so. But you're going to lend a certain percentage, and you're going to lend it at a very low interest rate, which will cover your administrative costs. That's one thing we can do. But the governments are going to say, well, we don't have enough wherewithal to do this, because you can see that we're in straitened circumstances, and people are already saying that Barack Obama will not have any room for maneuver if, as I certainly hope, he is elected. But the difference in the United States between taxes owed and taxes actually collected is $350 billion a year, without changing the tax structure at all. Now, he has said he's going to tax people making over $250,000, and that he will have tax cuts for the middle class. Okay, but how about collecting the taxes that are owed? How about closing down the tax havens that are used by these people with government approval, or at least one has to think so, because the loopholes have all been built into the legislation, and there are corporations that have not paid any taxes for many, many years. How about cutting out all subsidies to oil companies, which are still receiving their sugar from the government? How about separating the banks into the two types that they were until about 10 or 12 years ago? In 1933, there was an act passed that said you can't have in the same institution a retail bank, the kind that receives your deposits and then lends to you and cashes your checks and so on, and an investment bank. But they, de facto, when the US merged them at the end of the 90s, they broke the law, and then Alan Greenspan said, well, it's happening anyway, so we might as well knock the law off the books. And the Glass-Steagall Act was thrown out. But they should be separated again. There should be retail banks and investment banks. We should cancel the debt of the South. We've been talking about it now for 10 years. It hasn't happened. At best, 18 to 20% of the debt of the poorest countries has been canceled. Let's do it. But I would say, again, with conditions, with environmental conditions, so that those countries can also participate in the worldwide environmental effort by reforestation programs, saving their soils, protecting biodiversity where it's much more abundant than in northern countries. And how about preventing African elites from continuing to skim off the money and sending it to the north? If a bank is too big to fail, as many of them now have shown themselves to be, then isn't it also too big to be private? Shouldn't it be a national resource? I don't know whether we should say just lend a part of your portfolios to the kinds of projects we need, or whether we should just say, you're nationalized, that's it. This should be part of a democratic debate. But what I do know is that we need some serious changes in the financial industry, which are not limited simply to transparency and to preventing banks from dealing in toxic securities or forbidding derivatives trading, for example. We got along perfectly well without derivatives up until about 12 years ago, but now they seem to be, there's been nominally at least $44 trillion, I don't even remember the number, but huge numbers of derivatives which nobody understands. So we really have to get the banks back under control and end tax breaks. Then there's other kinds of taxation. If you say, well, taxes have to stop at the national borders, then you're stuck with trying to claw back the taxes that aren't paid and tax the people making over $250,000. But if you think outside that particular box, you can say, but we could also tax currency transactions. We could also tax the huge amounts that were being traded, and maybe still are, before the financial crisis. Every day, $3.2 trillion, 3,2 mille milliards de dollars étaient échangés sur les marchés des devises, traded on foreign currency markets every day, 3.2 trillion. Well, if you tax that at just 1 basis point, 0.1%, you would rake in billions of dollars which you could use to solve the poverty inequality crisis and the ecological crisis. Because I don't want to forget about the poverty crisis here. It's time we stopped talking about poverty lines and had a poverty floor under which people are not allowed to fall. That too was part of Keynesianism, but it was wiped out little by little. In the US also by President Clinton, not just by the right. And in Europe, this has been an ongoing practice. We need to re-nationalize a certain number of public services that have been handed over to the private sector as windfalls. We need particularly to make sure that our transport systems are efficient. And we could also tax transnational corporations in order to do that. Accountants have figured all of this out. They have something in their boxes called a Unitary Profits Tax, which is actually quite simple to do, because if you know the sales of a company in a particular national jurisdiction and how much that company has paid in taxes in that jurisdiction, you can see that if you're selling, say, 50% of your goods in one place but only paying 5% of your taxes there, there's something very fishy going on. And it's probably because that's a high tax jurisdiction and companies would much rather pay or say that they are paying in a low tax jurisdiction. And they do it all the time. And it's a fact also that 1/2 of the financing of all world trade goes through a tax haven at one point or another in the transaction. And they use transfer pricing all the time, which is to say, I'm selling to myself some good that I need, to some component of a product that I am making, and I will buy it at a price which is advantageous to me in a tax sense. That's what bank lawyers and accountants and tax consultants do all day long. So all of these things are not technically difficult things to do. They are, we know how to do most of them. I will not say that all the solutions we could put into place are as cheap now as the conventional solutions, and that's also why we need targeted government spending in order to make them, to mass produce them and bring down the price of a unit of energy from solar or wind or wave power or a better hydrogen engine, because that won't happen if we simply trust to the market, particularly when petroleum continues to go down. Thomas Friedman, whom I usually don't care much for, but he's had one good idea, at least in his most recent book, and that is that if petroleum has gone up to $140, for instance, which was the case not long ago, then a government can say, okay, the floor price of petroleum will henceforward be $100 a barrel. It will not go below $100 a barrel. Therefore, an industry can say, okay, it will be economical for me to count on an alternative form of energy because I know that I don't have to compete with oil at $60 or $40 a barrel. That, I think, is a good idea. And I'm sure that there are many other good ideas out there. But we need a floor for people. We need to keep them in their houses. All of those who are being foreclosed on and losing their dwellings should be allowed to stay there and simply pay a rent over however many years it takes. But it's not because they were victims of the subprime slumlords, so to speak, that they should be penalized and thrown out of their homes. And it's not even smart economically speaking, because that will make the more homes there are on the market, the more prices will go down for everyone. So those are just a few ideas. I think that these ideas should come out of a democratic debate. You will have your own lists of things that people can do. I have my list, but it's not a limited list. But above all, I think that politically we have to make clear that this is a win-win scenario. I am convinced that the politicians who would adopt a program of this kind would be elected. I am convinced that citizens are far ahead of most of their governments on these issues, that they would approve of this kind of issue. And that just as we are going to see the Republicans, I believe, thrown out because now everybody can see what the consequences of their policies have been, so it will happen at different times. I realize that you've just had an election here in which, yes, we know that, but your time will come, don't worry. And that we must, in order to convince the politicians that this is a win-win scenario, we need a lot of social forces. I also believe that now no interest group can win by itself. This has been true for about the last 10 years because politics is much more international, and therefore, if it's just the ecological groups, if it's just the worldwide Fund for Nature people and the Greenpeace people and the Friends of the Earth people, by themselves they can't win that fight. By themselves, trade unions cannot win the fight about better wages and working conditions. By themselves, women cannot win real equality. by themselves farmers cannot win the battle of the family farm, etc., etc. Which is why we have to come together, and we have to be putting our talents together and our strengths as people who elect politicians and have our programs put together. We need a lot of debate in all of our societies about exactly what it is we want. I'm trying to contribute to this Keynesian program, which I think is a common sense program, but it also has to be a common cause. And that's why I'm very grateful to be speaking to young people in Canada who are going to have to, mostly young people. I realize that there are also others closer to my age and professors and a lot of influential people, but I am especially happy that so many students have turned out, because we need to have your fresh ideas, and we need to have your political force as well. I know you have student issues, but even there, students by themselves, I don't think, can win even on their own issues. Well, you might say, what about those people whose motto is all for ourselves but nothing for other people? Even there, we might have a possibility. What if we created a new order, a really exclusive order, like the Légion d'honneur? But we could call it the Earth Defenders, or the Carbon Conquerors, or something like that, and we could resuscitate the idea of the $1-a-year men, but it would be really exclusive and really hard to get into. And if you got into it, you could have a rosette, a green and gold rosette in your buttonhole, and you could have a flag on your car, and you could have a banner in front of your house, but it would be really hard to get into, and it would only be for the ones who had contributed the most to the ecological conversion. And I think we can do all of this without having another war. So thank you very much for your attention, and we have a half an hour for you to ask questions. Thank you.
I was thinking of this wonderful slogan, yes, we can. Donc, we're inviting people to ask questions. There are 2 microphones. Pendant qu'ils sont en train de se réveiller, moi j'en ai une pour vous. Alors, je veux qu'on revienne un petit peu sur la crise, et la crise des crises. Et finalement, spontanément, il y a 2 choses qui nous viennent à l'esprit. Est-ce qu'on est à la veille de 1929? C'est-à-dire le crash, ou est-ce qu'on est en 1987 avec le gros déclin qui a été réparé, spiné, etc., puis les choses ont continué? Qu'est-ce que vous répondriez à ça?
Moi, je répondrais qu'on est plutôt en 29, mais qu'en 29, il a fallu 4 ans. Il a fallu 4 ans pour même commencer à faire quelque chose, parce que Roosevelt est entré en fonction en 1933. Et jusque-là, c'était Herbert Hoover et c'était les néoconservateurs. Alors peut-être qu'on est un peu, ou les anciens conservateurs. Alors peut-être qu'on est un peu plus intelligent aujourd'hui et nous pouvons éviter, mais si nous ne faisons rien et si nous n'avons pas une cassure très nette dans le type de solution impliquée et mise en œuvre, je crois que nous sommes en 29, et nous le sommes mondialement, parce que la mondialisation marche dans ce sens-là. Certains économistes, au début de cette crise, en particulier vers janvier-février, disaient « ne vous inquiétez pas », ils appelaient ça la decoupling. The economies are decoupled. It was rubbish, it was nonsense. Donc ça va toucher tout le monde, Chine, Brésil, Inde, etc., compris.
My name is Susan Spronk, and we've met before. I'm a new professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies. I met you in Ottawa in 1997, and I just want to congratulate you because you were one of the first people that really inspired me to consider the path of intellectual activism. And secondly, one of the things that you put on the table tonight is class analysis and why we have mainstream gender, race to some extent, although certain definite setbacks after 9/11, as we all know, especially in this country and our partners to the south. But class is one that's sort of fallen off the agenda. And so what I'm going to do in the spirit of democratic debate is challenge you a bit on some of your suggestions that were in anything that looks like 1929. And while I do agree with you that Keynesian solutions would certainly be better and are necessary, what's missing historically is the context in which we got social democracy in the North. That context included an organized and revolutionary left, which was not exclusively led by trade union movements, but for example, in Canada, the Communist Party in 1930, I don't remember the exact date, won about 26%. And at that time, political leaders were starting to think, we have to do something because there was a specter of communism after the revolution of 1919 in Russia, correct? And so my question is maybe where we're supposed to be looking for leadership right now, and I should just admit that I do it where we should be looking for leadership. I do a lot of my work in Latin America, particularly on Bolivia, and also have an interest in Venezuela, where we have an interesting process happening where we have world leaders again, which call themselves socialists, and we can have, that's another debate about what that means in that context. So I suppose what I'm saying is in terms of, I agree that we need these solutions and we need regulations, but given the fact that we've pointed out some of the contradictions and perhaps what might be dynamics of the capitalist system, which are very difficult to control, whether that is really the answer in terms of political strategy. It's a big question and it's a challenge, but it's one that I think, and just to point out that Amazon.com is reporting increased sales of Karl Marx, which is kind of interesting in the current conjuncture. But thank you.
My instinct is to say thank you and I don't know, because it is too big a question, and I don't think that class conflict is going to disappear by magic, even if we manage to get international taxation with redistribution in a real Keynesian program. Where have you gone now? I wanted to talk to you. Oh, thank you. In a real Keynesian program of taxation and redistribution, I have no, I don't believe that class conflict would disappear. There were still worker management conflicts during the Second World War, during the great transformation of the Second World War, but there were also some advances because women and minorities got better wages and they got a chance to work in the economy, which was then taken from them in the 50s. But okay, I mean, there were advances then. And I think there would be again, but of course it would have to be very strictly encadré. It would have to be with very strict rules, particularly about what the banks could and couldn't do, which is why I think that the first order of the day is to make finance the servant and not the master of the way society is organized. I think the banks should also be obliged to finance social enterprises, help to create bigger networks of social economy. It's said that already 6 or 7% of the US economy is a social economy. I don't know if that figure is right, and I don't know exactly where that even comes from. But because I don't see the revolutionary solution at all on the horizon, and I don't believe in the Hart Negri multitude of coming up and somehow transforming everything, and that there is this huge silent majority, as it used to be called, except it's on the other side of politics, that is going to come in and solve the problem. So I'm trying to be very pragmatic simply because of the urgency that I feel. If we had 50 years to deal with global warming, I would say, okay, let's wait for a much more ideal political moment. But I'm intensely conscious that we have to use the political forces and the historical forces that we have here and now, and there's no point in complaining that they are not better ones or different ones. So yes, lots of really interesting things are happening in Latin America, but our historical situations are not the same as those, and we should support those governments, but not think that we can copy them in some way in societies which are deeply different. I realize this is an unsatisfactory answer, and all I can say is Obama is less awful than McCain, but I don't think, as I said in Montreal the other night, where this sort of question came up, that I don't believe that he cures lepers and walks on water either. You know, I don't think that wouldn't change absolutely everything, but would certainly be better to have someone more open to this kind of solution than not.
Oui, et cette fois-ci, je vais parler en mon nom et non pas au nom de l'école. D'abord, moi aussi, j'ai été très touchée par votre présentation et ça m'a replongée dans mes souvenirs. Je suis le produit d'un coup d'État, d'un 11 septembre, non pas celui auquel pensent la plupart des Nord-Américains, mais bien le 11 septembre de 1973 au Chili. Et j'ai vécu justement l'époque, très jeune encore, mais des grands projets, des ambitions, nationalisation des services, nationalisation des banques, nationalisation des ressources minières, et vous savez la suite, un coup d'État sanglant. Et ma question irait un peu dans le sens de celle de ma collègue sur les liens que vous faites entre un tel processus de nationalisation et l'inclusion sociale, parce que vous pouvez très bien encourager un processus... Pardon ?
Entre la nationalisation des banques et
des services
publics.
Et l'inclusion sociale, c'est ça. Merci.
Allez-y.
I wasn't sure if you had mentioned before when you were talking about the problem with corn from the south, the maize, coming up to the United States. Was that a problem with Chapter 11 in NAFTA, where once the flow starts, it's hard
I'm sorry, on what point? On NAFTA?
Yes, on NAFTA. Where is it a problem where
about the ruin of hundreds of thousands of Mexican farmers?
Exactly. Is
okay.
that is the flow of corn coming because of a problem with, say, Chapter 11, where they can't stop importing it, in which case they have no choice? Or I'm not sure if you know the answer to that.
Okay.
And the second question was just more amusing. I guess we're in real trouble if we're having a social, economic, and environmental problem. I guess it's perfect on sustainability in that sense. But I was just wondering, in your opinion, do you think that this bust time for the economy may actually turn out to be a bit of a boon for the environment?
Okay, well, I can deal with the Mexican question very quickly, which is that what happened when the frontiers were opened to agricultural goods as well as all other kinds of goods, U.S. corn flooded into Mexico. It was subsidized corn. It was also produced under hugely capitalistic, mechanized conditions with, so that meant that the bushel cost less for the capitalist producer than for the poor guy in Chiapas or Oaxaca, and that since it was subsidized, it was also sold at under the market price at which a Mexican farmer could produce. He simply could not, what it cost him to produce his bushel of corn was more than the price that was going on the Mexican market because of this huge inflow. So that simply ruined people who couldn't sell their corn anymore because the tortillas were being made out of American maize, and the figures that I have seen, and I use the lower ones, are the order of 200 to 300,000 farmers. But some people talk in terms of millions. So I don't really know. I mean, Kate Bronfenbrenner has done a lot of work on this at Cornell, and I just repeat what I read and what other people have worked on. But that's easy to, and yes, there will be fewer cars on the road maybe, or more economical cars on the road, and maybe, but that isn't going to cure it. That is a solution on the order of all of you go out now and change your light bulbs, which I have nothing against. I think it's great if you all go out and change your light bulbs, but have no illusions that that's going to be enough. We have a problem of scale. Then I'll go back to the nationalization question afterwards, but please.
You mentioned that you were looking forward to a Barack Obama victory.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's something that we should really, really throw our, really get excited about Mr. Obama winning when he has people like Larry Summers, Barry Rubin on his team, the architects really of some of the worst deregulation that happened in the Clinton years, when Obama has received so much money from the banking industry, and he's just been more successful than McCain in eliciting these funds. The first president to not receive public funding for his campaign and wholly, just rely on funds from the private sector. And he says they get a little bit from, citizens and all that, but most of it's coming from the big banks who will be bailed out and continue to be bailed out, I'm sure, regardless of who's the president. And regarding your other question about these sort of model citizens from the elite that we could put up, the dollar people that we could have, I believe, I see Jeffrey Sachs and Bono, they go to Davos and they talk about, world poverty, and then they go, Jeffrey Sachs went to some Kenyan village with Angelina Jolie and scared villagers there. Is that really a solution? I mean, should these people be thrown in jail? Something like that. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs, rather than writing books talking about prescribing the solution to the problem that, he and the other people have created. So thank you.
Well, that's, I think, that was a good statement. It was a very good statement. I think we're here in a conflict of the best and the possible to some degree. Yes, it would be better if Obama had different people advising him. Some of them, I'm told, on the foreign policy side are not bad, but certainly I have nothing to say favorable about Larry Summers, and in fact I've said many disagreeable things about him in books when he was at the World Bank. Bob Rubin was a clever Secretary of the Treasury, but and probably more clever than Paulson, and he was a big help to Clinton, and he left a surplus, not a huge deficit. But, I mean, this is a capitalist society. So again, should we wait for the revolution and wait to have better social forces that can produce that, or should we get together now and say, all right, these were bad policies, we don't want Larry Summers repeating what was done. We don't want Alan Greenspan Bies to be running the Federal Reserve. And that's where, I mean, politics doesn't end because there's been a vote. And Obama will owe us something, whereas McCain would owe us nothing. So I try to see windows where they exist. But I'm far from saying that they are ideal. And yes, he's apparently got $600 billion, and he'll be on the, maybe we all have to leave now so that we can see him on television, because he's going to be on every channel practically in the world, and it's costing how much? Who told me how much it's costing? Bob? It's costing an awful lot anyway. So, but let's not, it's very hard when you're 20 years old not to say that, it's got to be that way. I remember that very well. I still do it myself, but le mieux est l'ennemi du bien. No? The best is sometimes the enemy of the good, or the improvement. Please go ahead.
This might be sort of a naive question, so please bear with me, but you mentioned that the citizens are usually much more progressive than the government or the politicians of the time, and that the majority of the citizens, they just they want change. But historically, why are they not leading? I mean, what's preventing all these progressive people from making their voice all the time, or why? What's that? I guess that's it.
Why haven't they won, you mean?
Yeah, why haven't they won before? Why haven't they won all the time if the majority of the citizens are always more progressive? What's holding them back?
They haven't won all the time for a very simple reason, which has been brought up already by the first person who spoke, Susan, mentioning the strength of the class which controls thought I've been talking about the effects of neoliberalism on people which have been dire, and I've been talking about that through various institutions that have been using these policies everywhere. But I hadn't really worked on where they came from. But what I can tell you now with no qualms at all is that the right had a very conscious policy of changing ideas and changing ideology. I call them the right-wing Gramscians because they understood Antonio Gramsci, they understood the notion of cultural hegemony, they understood that you had to take your ideas in what Gramsci called the long march through the institutions, and you had to bring them into every institution, the media, the judiciary, the cinema, the universities very important, push them through the think tanks, even bring them into the church, into the family, etc. The long march through the institutions, and change the way Americans think. And they paid for this. They sponsored conservative scholars. They went to the universities and they said, look, your whole political science department is much too far to the left. You're not teaching a balanced program in the name of balance and scholarly neutrality and all this nonsense. I don't believe in neutrality in the social sciences. I don't think it's possible. I think all of us go in there with some preconceived notions, and if we admit it, we're honest, and those who don't admit it are simply being dishonest, but it exists. And this tactic cost $1 billion and some over a period of 30 years. I mean, I've documented myself the $1 billion between 1982 and about 2001, spent only on ideas, only on people who could produce and disseminate ideas, on media, on publications, on making sure that the neoconservative was part of the furniture on the television show, the talk show, you know. And this went from the academic journal right down to the campus newspaper, all of them subsidized, in order to change the way people thought. That's power. Because as Gramsci said, you can't just win through using repression and the police and, you know, the club. No, it's much better to be in people's heads. So why didn't ordinary people win? Because they were much less well organized than these people at the top who had a very clear program. And let's face it, throughout history, I mean, Spartacus did not free the slaves. It took many centuries more. Women did not win right away. The suffragette movement, even to get the vote, went on for decades. Slavery didn't end in the U.S. for decades after people began struggling against it, etc., etc. I mean, a win is something quite rare, and particularly to make it last is quite rare. Because the moment you don't pay attention, and that's what the progressives in the United States stopped doing. I suppose they thought their own ideas were so wonderful that they didn't have to defend them, but they didn't. So that's part of the answer. You have to worry about what's in people's heads, too. Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
There you go.
Wonderful, refreshing, interesting. A couple of things. I was trying to form up questions because the comments, you know, I don't want to get the comments to get in the way of a decent question. But when you mentioned ideas, because I'm forming up because from just talking to this young gentleman and then the first woman that spoke in class, and you mentioned the war and you mentioned the last war and you mentioned that as a model, and that gets me a little shaky. I question that. The $1 a year man. The industries were all cost plus, fortunes were made on that. The capitalists were always in control. We're talking about the capitalist system. You've given us you've talked about it and how bad it is. But one thing I didn't hear you talk about at all. If you did, say it or elaborate on it, please. Maybe I've got hearing problems. War and war industries, and the huge, incredibly complex system, particularly in the US, is driving a huge part of the economy is the war industries, and the military-industrial complex is enormous. And the wars in Afghanistan and the recent spate of wars are driven by the system. In other words, capitalism is driven by war. This crisis is only a result of that. So back into the system here, war drives capitalism back. When you talk about the last war, and you talk about the dollar a year man, what capitalism was doing that time was to defeat fascism. So all the thing about ideas was already going on in Nazi Germany. They just took it 200,000 steps further, and that had to be defeated. Capitalism had to be brought back to a kind of a more moderate stage, so the US did that. But the Soviet Union, it wasn't defeated. You look at those things. At the end of the day, capitalism will only be brought down through war. It's a war machine. It's totally integrated to war. And every aspect of it, in one shape or another, is integrated into war. And yet you didn't mention that once. And yet the other part of the alternative of workers and people is the cooperative economies and the cooperative models.
The what economies?
A cooperative. As are run. Okay, that's the question. Your war, and then the other model is the cooperative models. I didn't hear you mention that, and they're massive and huge, and do work, and are, as we talk, working in this country too. Thank you, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Let's do all the rest of them.
My question is, considering the lack of leadership with regards to economics, the economic, social, and environmental crises, and considering the market is king in our current capitalist system, do you think the market could be the solution to the current crises? Do you believe in market-driven initiatives such as fair trade, for example, carbon offsetting, organic certification? Mm-hmm. And do you think these have potential to change our system?
Okay, good question. Thank you.
Within the context, you mentioned we could negate the debt to the South by requiring, instead of our current strings, change the strings for environmental sustainable activities in exchange for eliminating their debt. In so much as the IMF and World Bank and similar institutions have created this debt in order to have leverage over those countries in the first place and are going to be loath to let go of that. And in the context where we just elected another conservative government, so clearly the investment in ideas is paying off on the right. How can we frame, pitch, sell these notions using, for example, the negation of the debt to developing countries, to the majority world? How can we pitch these ideas such that they will be received?
Okay. I think that the question of capitalism feeding on war and vice versa, that's a valid argument, and certainly the United States has been using military Keynesianism for years. I mean, I think the arms industry is now, I'm certainly not a specialist on this, but I think the arms industry is generally considered to be about $1 trillion a year, that many jobs in the United States, in Britain and in France, depend on war-oriented industries, and the French certainly have been using military Keynesianism for years. So I do not neglect this argument, but I would also point out that the European Union has never been so rich as it is now, and that is because it has been at peace in Europe for 50 years. Now that doesn't mean that wars are not exported. We can see Afghanistan, we can see Iran, etc. But there also comes a point there where, the United States is seriously overstretched, and anybody can recognize that. And they can't open up new fronts everywhere. So I think that there is perhaps a possibility, I may be wrong, but I think there's a possibility to reorient spending away from militarism, which is not usually productive investment. It doesn't produce capital goods. It produces armaments which are sterile. They don't create anything. They just create death. And so since the US cannot open up new fronts, militarily speaking, and I don't think it's going to continue to follow the Petraeus doctrine, which is that you have to have the capacity to intervene anywhere where there is instability which could threaten US interests. That can't be the doctrine. It just simply isn't financially possible. So maybe even there's a chance to change it. But surely there's going to be a temptation to fascism. I don't see the person who asked that question now. I'm sorry. There's not going to be, there is going to be a temptation to fascism, because whenever you have a crisis and whenever people are losing their jobs and factories are closing and so on, there is always a tendency to blame it on the person next door. That immigrant has taken my job, rather than seeing the larger picture. And that too we shall have to guard against. That's a very dangerous question. Can we expect market-driven initiatives to change things? Well, I'm not anti-market. I mean, I don't think markets should be allowed to decide everything. And I think the real debate is not about should we have markets or not, because that seems to me to have been decided for us by the end of the Cold War and so on. But the question really is what should be in the market and what shouldn't. And personally, I don't think water should be in the market. I think it should be municipally or, commonly owned. I don't think that a lot of energy should be in the market. This sort of thing should be the result of democratic debate, where people decide what they want to have in the market and not. And this brings us, and so of course, fair trade, that can help. But again, it's like the light bulbs. It's not going to change the whole trade system. It's a good thing to do it, but not to believe that that is going to be the panacea. But if you don't have fair trade coffee in this university right now, then you should organize to get it. Yes, definitely. Now, this takes us to the Canadian politics question, which I really can't answer. And perhaps it's going to be decided from outside. Perhaps because Canada is an economy dependent both on the US and on Europe for its trading and so on. Perhaps despite Harper and his people, it will have to conform to a certain number of policies if we can get decent policies elsewhere. I don't know. I'm sorry, but I really can't comment with any kind of intelligence about Canadian politics. And I don't want to forget Andrea's question either. If I understood it properly, you were asking whether the nationalization of the banks and the reclaiming public services shouldn't go together. Was that approximately what? Okay, well, of course, in what I would propose, if the banks are nationalized, partially, fully, whatever, then a part of their loans, as I think I said, must be reserved for people in order that they can stay in their houses, should be reserved for people who want to reconvert their houses, should be reserved for ordinary people who need to, or for social housing, or for whatever kinds of public services like transport are part of the social wage. Many services like health, education, and transportation are part of the social wage. Paying into pension funds which are not connected to the stock market, that is part of the social future wage that you receive when you're over 60 or 65. So yes, I think that the two definitely go together. And we have just spent 3 decades privatizing absolutely everything, because this was the doctrine. Private is always better than public. You can sum it up in 4 words, private good, public bad. And this has caused deaths in societies which are poorer than our own, as in places where there have been famines, like Niger, where everything was privatized because the International Monetary Fund insisted on it, and therefore farmers had no access to stocks, of food that would tide them over to the next harvest, no access to veterinary services which had been national, no access to transportation to market, and all of these forces contributed to creating a major famine in which a lot of people died, which is the effects are still being felt. So, of course, I think that the two go together, but I believe it starts with finance, because finance has been allowed to go so far that if we don't get finance back under control, then the rest is going to be very problematic. So finance is the priority. With that, then you can begin to solve at the same time the poverty inequality crisis, of which public services, health, education, and so on are part, and the ecological crisis. Et avec ça, je crois que je vous remercie beaucoup, et je laisse la dernière parole à Pierre.
C'est nous qui vous remercions. Alors, just before thanking Susan, I want to attract your attention to the fact that this is an event, part of a series organized by our school on important issues. And the next shot is November 6th, next week, and it's a fantastic seminar on the return of the excluded women from Latin America and the rest of the continent. Indigenous women and Afro-Caribbean women talking about their resistance and their alternatives to the crisis. So check it out, please, on the website. So thank you, Susan. We have two things to give you tonight. The first thing is that you see the University of Ottawa is so influential that just before you came in, we called Barack Obama. And he's waiting for you tonight so that you can give him your solutions to this crisis. So thank you. I'm sure you're going to do a nice job. And the second thing is that we have a small gift so that you will think about us in the next while.
May I open it now?
Yes, you can. Yes, we can. Alors donc, je vous remercie tout le monde et à la prochaine. Spécialement cet atelier très important sur le retour des exclus que nous organisons ici à l'école le 6, n'est-ce pas? Le 6? Le 6 novembre. Alors, merci beaucoup et à la prochaine.
Le 6 novembre sur femmes autochtones et afrodescendantes. Et merci encore.